Hello everybody, I'm Simon from Rivermole Riverwatch, and what we're going to do today is talk about the upward trends in storm overflow duration in the Rivermole catchment. We're looking at the discharges of raw sewage from Thames Water assets that are monitored and looking at the trends over time. The biggest sewage works here are shown as the biggest blobs, are discharging the longest duration of storm overflows of any of the assets. The smaller blobs tend to be the pumping stations and smaller assets. Pumping stations pump sewage to the sewage treatment works. The first thing to say is that 2024 saw an increase in total duration of storm overflows from these assets, from the infrastructure, up to 13,615 hours. In 2024, last year, 60% of sites recorded an increase in storm overflow duration. Now, this is despite lower rainfall than 2023. Rainfall is shown as this blue line here, and you can see that actually 2023 was quite a wet year for the Mole catchment. 2024 was also fairly wet, but it was less wet than 2023. There is some correlation, quite close correlation with rainfall, but it's not perfect. An increase of storm overflow duration whilst having a drier year is not a good trend. Here's the sewage treatment works, the major sewage treatment works in the Rivermole catchment, of which there are 9. Many of them have had an uptick, quite a strong uptick, since 2022. Now, yes, that was a drier year, and the last 2 years have been fairly wet, but we can see that it's not all the same. Some, in fact, have peaked in 23 and then dropped, like Homewood, albeit at a very high level. Others have surged almost continuously since 2019, such as Esher. The ones down here I've described as falling from an earlier peak. For example, Dorking had its peak in 2020 and then actually decreased quite a bit in 2021 and has continued at this sort of 800-hour level ever since. Similar at Earlswood, servicing Reigate. Overall, sewage treatment works have had an average of 50% increase in storm overflow duration over this period. The EDM online average here is 97%, which means that the monitors are working most of the time. So this data is pretty strong. Here we've got each individual EDM and the total for the year. Biggest offenders are the big sewage treatment works. These are the ones over on the left-hand side here. Burstow, Crawley, Dorking, Earlswood, Esher, Homewood, Hawley, Leatherhead. Merstone's quite small, but these are the ones which are discharging the longest in the catchment. The ones over here are either smaller sewage treatment works, like Colgate, for example, all the way across to Box Hill. Irons Bottom has been behaving very badly. It's a small sewage treatment works. Charlwood also is a pumping station, not performing well. Pease Pottage is one we'll look at in a minute. And also Cobham, a pumping station, is not performing well. Here's a map showing pumping stations across the Mole catchment, of which there are over 300, and they each service a sewage treatment works. So the ones around here will service Esher, they'll pump sewage to Esher sewage treatment works, that's why some are outside the catchment. Not all of these have monitors. 17 pumping stations have event duration monitors, so we're getting only a partial picture of what could be a much bigger figure. Here is the data for the ones we know, or selected ones that we know. On average, there's been an enormous increase in storm overflow duration across this period, something like 270% increase on average for all of these pumping stations. So these are smaller assets discharging for less long than the sewage works, but they're often discharging into very small streams, which are therefore more vulnerable. So, for example, Pease Pottage discharges into Stamford Brook, which is a very small headwater stream of the Mole catchment south of Crawley. Charlwood discharges into Mansbrook, which is a very small tributary of the Upper Mole. Commonside at Bookham discharges into Bookham Brook, which is an ephemeral chalk stream, so very vulnerable. And you can see many of these have seen really quite an astonishing increase. The ones that are more wobbly, like Stonebridge, are because they're offline. Stonebridge was offline for 50% of the time in 2022, so it's only a partial picture. But of the ones we can see, especially Irons Bottom, which I know is a small wastewater treatment works, but essentially it's just not performing. In fact, locals tell us that Thames Water tankers quite frequently have to visit Irons Bottom during wet weather to take away excess, which it's not coping with. And the rest of these show a similar story of increasing durations. So this is the story with pumping stations. They seem to be performing less well than the sewage treatment works in terms of storm overflow duration. The result of this is an impact on river health, especially in these small streams, these little streams with low volume of flow. The storm overflow duration pattern, as we can see here, does match rainfall. There's a reasonable correlation. This is looking at rainfall as a percent of long-term average at Charlwood, which is a Met Office weather station. And you can see there was a gradual decrease in rainfall to a dry period in 2022, but it's not an absolutely perfect correlation with storm overflow duration, because 2020 was slightly drier but saw higher levels of storm overflows, and indeed 2024 was a tad drier than 2023 and yet saw surging storm overflow duration. This is even more obvious when you look at the count of sites recording their highest spill duration, and in 2024, despite lower rainfall, 11 out of 30 sites recorded their highest spill duration, while 18 sites recorded increased spill duration over 2023, despite it being a drier year. So we're kind of seeing, as we saw in 2020 when there was an increase in discharges, despite it being drier than the previous year, we're kind of seeing a much stronger increase in the number of monitors recording their highest spill duration. It seems to just be going up, and that's the highest spill duration of the entire period. What are we seeing here? A decoupling of spill duration from rainfall, showing assets are under more stress. Just a reminder at the bottom, the aim of the storm overflow reduction plan is that by 2050 no storm overflows will be permitted to operate outside of unusually heavy rainfall. Well, they already do this, of course, because they start spilling almost immediately. It starts raining, really. I'll show you some evidence of that. Let's look at one example of a pumping station and how it's performed in the face of growth of housing. We're not being NIMBY-ish here. We just need to know that these assets are going to be upgraded so they can cope with the additional volumes of wastewater produced by housing. So in 2018, the Pease Pottage site which had been earmarked for growth and development. A developer wanted to put housing onto these fields here and put plans in, I think, in 2015. So by 2020, work had started. 2022, it was really getting on to being finished. They were occupied. And 2024, a bit fuzzy, but you can see in this satellite picture that it's more or less finished. Housing estate, Woodgate, is on a ridge just south of Crawley, which is down here. The land drops away to the Stamford Brook to the south, which is where the Pease Pottage pumping station is located. And that has serviced the community of Pease Pottage and the service station with wastewater from those locations. The wastewater comes down the hill and is pumped back over the hill to Crawley to join the gravity mains in Crawley, which I'll show you in a minute. But of course, this pumping station, when it spills into a very small stream called Stamford Brook, which makes its way to the Gatwick stream through very high quality, important woodland habitat, which is a refuge for rare flora, especially in these wet dells, which even have heritage sites like pillow mounds and old iron furnace ponds and things like that. So it's quite a historic brook. Quick look at what it looks like through the forest, just near to the pumping station, this picture in the middle, and it shows discharge event after some wet weather. This one is earlier in the year, which is a frosty morning, and you can see the brook here is clear with no discharge event. The sewage pumping station at Pease Pottage is very reactive to rainfall, and this is shown by this chart, but also Thames Water itself recognises this as very reactive to rainfall, which means that as soon as it starts raining, discharge events happen. Even less than 10 millimetres of rain can cause discharges, albeit short duration. But as soon as you're tipping over into 20 millimetres in 24 hours, duration of discharge goes up a lot. When the plans went in for 600 houses at Woodgate, Thames Water objected early, and letters that are on the council plans indicates that the foul network does not have available capacity downstream of the proposed connection manhole to accept the proposed development flows. In another note, they said, following an investigation, Thames Water has identified an inability of the existing wastewater infrastructure to accommodate the needs of this application. The reason is that the development may lead to sewage flooding. So it's in black and white here. Crawley also objected here to wastewater, that it might exceed the capacity by 2026 in this area, and therefore there is no capacity for further residential development. But then, of course, the impact study that Thames Water wanted showed and reminded everybody that it's the responsibility of Thames Water to extend and maintain the drainage network and sewage treatment works to cope with any additional loads. So therefore, responsibility is completely loaded onto Thames Water just to cope with additional housing. This is the setup of the location as we see it now. These are the houses that have been built down here, and the Pease Pottage pumping station takes the wastewater from these houses, then pumps it back over the hill, takes it on a 14-kilometre journey to Crawley Sewage Treatment Works where it is treated. This is the result of what we see. 2015 was when the plans were put in place. 2018 it was still a greenfield site. There was quite a lot of building in 2020. There was a spike here, in just like other pumping stations in 2020. Occupation of housing would have started here, and since then we've seen just an increase in the duration of discharge from Pease Pottage pumping station to a peak in 2024. We can also relate that to the long-term average of rainfall, just like the other ones, and we can see that despite a dip in rainfall in 2024, we have far longer storm overflow duration from this pumping station. It discharges an awful lot more than it was, even taking into account rainfall. It doesn't explain it. Thames Water do have a plan. It's called the Drainage Wastewater Master Plan. It wants to limit environmental impact by discharging on average no more than 10 times per year, and also to build resilience against stormwater, to stop all discharges of untreated sewage into rivers across the entire network, and lead to the improvement of the environment and clean up of rivers in our region to become the healthiest in the UK. Well, Stamford Brook is a tiny brook, and any discharges of sewage into it are very damaging. Are we therefore risking a trend to increase storm overflows? Well, we shouldn't assume so, but with the second runway at Gatwick coming along, that is increasing numbers of travellers coming through the airport, with thousands of new homes being planned in the catchment, and climate change driven in increasingly intense rainfall, we're seeing all this adding increased pressures to already struggling Thames Water assets. And the data I've shown you, I think it really does show this very starkly. Thames Water itself recognises that the implications of growth and climate change are staggering. Without Thames Water being able to spend money improving these assets, including pumping stations, we're going to see increased, or likely going to see increased sewage discharges rather than decrease. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope that is interesting.